and welcome to the Beer Ladies podcast. I'm your host, Erica, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Thandi, Katie, and Lisa. And today we're going to be continuing with our style series and covering porters. So if we could go around and say hello as well as what we're drinking, we'll start with Thandi.
Cool. Hello, everybody. So this is a tale of how I couldn't find a porter anywhere near me, mostly because I didn't try that hard, but also because there's just not that many around. So shout out to all the breweries. Please, could we have a few more porters, especially somewhere in South County Dublin? That would be grand. So I decided to pull a little bit of an irony trick, and you'll understand this fully as the episode goes on. But I've got a stout. And I've got a good old Guinness, but it's a Guinness original, so it's an extra, it's bigger and darker, I think. And I haven't had one for an age, so I just figured let's have a stout instead, since they're kind of the same thing anyway. Cool.
Does it have a widget?
No,
Guinness?
No.
No widget.
No.
Okay.
No widget. It's not a nitro, so it's got a bit of a rockier head than what typical Guinness has.
And how about you, Katie?
So I had sourced a porter, dark arts, but let's just say I'm a little bit worse for wear today, so I'm actually on the water, I could make up some shite like I have to bring the kids somewhere later, but no, let's call a spade a spade. And
Katie, it's all hair of the dog anyway. You should just, it'll make you feel better.
No, I just can't face it right now.
That's fair enough.
That's fair enough. You do you.
And Lisa, what are you drinking?
So I have Western Herd's Night Pod Vanilla Porter, and this one is actually one that started off as a homebrew competition winner, working with McHugh's, and David Mara won that. So if Beer Twitter, he's very much a stalwart on there. Well, the whiskey as well. So good job, Western Herd and David. It's nice to see this sort of commercially produced, and I think it'll be good to talk about porters with things in them, as well as what we'll call sort of more normal porters. So nice to find this.
I had that one recently myself and really enjoyed it. Yeah. So today I am drinking Whiplash beer, the Scaldy Porter Robust Porter, and I'm just showing the camera the artwork, and it's one of my favorite labels. It has kind of a cloudburst head with different beautiful colors. And just a reminder, we can be found on all your podcatchers as well as YouTube and the socials, Beer Ladies Podcast on Facebook and Beer Ladies Pod on Instagram and Twitter. And you can also buy me a coffee or beer, which is another way that you can support us as we're self-funded. So to kick us off, we're going to start at the beginning with the history of porters, and our historian Lisa is going to give us the story.
I'll give it a try, and I'll apologize, listeners, if my voice is a little weird. I did have to do some shouting from the touchline at soccer for my daughter's game a little earlier today, so we're working with what we have. But
do a shout out there to Baby Bose, will we?
Yes, Baby Bose, yay! So yeah, that was good fun, and at least it didn't rain, so we will take it. But porter is an interesting one because there's this definite tie with stout, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I think, like with so many other beer styles, there are some things we have to debunk, because for years and years and years, there's been the story that Ralph Harwood in Shoreditch in 1722 invented, which I'm putting in big air quotes, porter, and that he did it as a more convenient form of the 3 threads, which is, for those not super into their 18th century beer history, this would have been essentially 3 different beers blended together: a fresh brown beer, which was probably a mild, a pale ale that had been matured for a while, and a what we would call a stale brown beer. Now, to us, that sounds kind of weird and maybe a little bit gross too, but that was popular at the time. Again, the 3 threads is something you see a lot if you read enough kind of things about 18th and even 17th century commercial beer history. But the important thing about this is that it's all lies. There's absolutely no real evidence that this was something that happened. definitely three threads was a real thing that was very much around, but there's no proper evidence that this is where porter came from. And lots of shout outs, as per usual, when we're talking beer history, to Martin Cornell, who not only sort of debunked this myth, and he points out that it comes from one source from around 1840. There's nothing else that, sort of ties into anything, but he does, sort of go into what was really happening here. Is it more likely, in fact, that, this does start in London, so it eventually makes its way over here later. We'll get to that, but there is a London brown beer. It is popular with the porters, although not necessarily the market porters. That's something else he's sort of debunked. It looks more like it's your railway and river porters who were drinking this. So very much kind of a working man's drink initially, but it eventually becomes the most popular style out there. And it's not what we would think about insofar as what we think of porter today, for the most part, although we might argue we're coming back around to that, because it would have been much hoppier, although not necessarily fresh hopped. Again, these things tended to be matured for a while, so they've gone sort of, been passed around a little bit. But what's interesting is that they typically would have been stored for many months before they would get out and about in the world. So they probably would have had a lot of Brettanomyces, a lot of sort of souring kind of things. But again, it might have also been stored for so long that they were quite mellow by the time they got to people, but they do have this dark color. And that's probably something that needs a little bit more, I would say, research. But I think we're going to get the goods, because Martin Cornell does have a book on porter coming out later this year. So
Brilliant.
Very much looking forward to that. He's been doing amazing work on it. But I think it's really, really interesting that, porter sort of starts out as this working man's drink, becomes wildly popular everywhere where sort of English and Irish style beers are going. And in fact, I know we mentioned this on our IPA episode, it's actually much, much, much more popular in the export trade than IPA. It is in fact the primary thing that is being exported to India, insofar as that's a thing that's happening. So that's the very, very, very quick sort of potted history of porter. But we will, I think, as we get through, talk about, well, how does stout figure into this? And are they kind of the same thing? What's a plain porter versus not? And is a pint of plain a stout or a porter? And are we incorrectly saying it when we're talking about a Guinness? So much, much more to unpack there. But I think before we get into that, we probably want to talk a little bit about some of the, how is it made now and how is that different? So lots of technical stuff to get into.
That myth is so pervasive.
Yes, yes.
Everywhere, because I was doing my research for this episode, and everywhere was quoting that they mixed the three different types of beer, and that's where porter came from. And I was like, no, that's not right.
No, it's not right.
Everywhere.
I know, and I think that one reason that is such a pervasive myth is, people picked up on it in kind of the 1990s, early 2000s, and were like, 'twas ever thus. And then when they're kind of reviving porter, I think it just kind of went from there. So all of your microbreweries from that period were sort of, sharing out this kind of dodgy history, and now we're stuck with it. And here it is. But again, Martin's book will come out, and I'm sure he'll do some good speaking engagements and so on, and can help say, no, this didn't happen. So,
but then Lisa, what was the historical context as to why porter became so popular? What was it about porter that was different from the beers of the day that made it so wildly popular?
That it's such an interesting question, and I think he is going to try to answer some of that more in the book. I did hear him on a good podcast last year talking a bit about it, and I think it hits this magical sort of spot of being tasty and being affordable, and then also something that could be transported and really kind of, not quite in the IPA story, survive the trip, but you could throw a lot at it. But I think there's probably something else too with, maybe the color also just gave people kind of a confidence in it, because this is before your clear, sparkly things become popular. So I think there's a mixture of relatively inexpensive materials and something that just people liked and could afford. So it's funny that it starts off as sort of a working man's drink, then becomes really widespread, then kind of goes back to sort of potentially a working man's drink again, and now is back out in the world again in different guises. But it's such an interesting sort of rise and fall and rise again, or at least hopefully rise again, because I think we all love porters. We want to see more of them. So let's hopefully get more out into the world.
It's just like everything is cyclical, it's like,
exactly.
It's like clear IPA, hazy IPA. Let's go back to clear IPA.
Exactly.
And I found that as well. I was reading a bit from Mark Dredge's books, and he was comparing stouts and porters actually, and says that the porter did come first and was known as London's beer, being a dark ale, and that the term stout became applied to existing beer types to signify that it was stronger, and there were different kind of subtypes such as the brown stout or the stout porter. And eventually stout just meant strong dark beer, and then dark beer, and there were connotations such as wholesome or healthy that were attached to it.
Marketing's greatest achievement.
Guinness is good for you, right?
Yeah,
Good for you.
or it makes you strong. And porters were kind of seen as more old-fashioned and really just got left by the wayside. And I think there was something to do with the war rations hitting the brewers, and then the porters kind of fell off the map. But then in the US, in the UK, craft breweries kind of brought them back with this resurgence. And today, most of what I read said that there is no real definable difference between the two styles of stout and porter, but stouts might have more of like the roasted barley bitterness than porters, which are lighter in body than a stout. And they would tend to be low to moderate hop flavor and roasty malted character. And I think that's why, like right now in winter, like it's such a like nice drink to have by the fire, you know. And I think there was also something about the big city brewers with the economies of scale, like they were able to industrialize more when they were developing the style of porter, and they had the market, and you know, people that were brewing in the smaller country towns were just making the ales. A couple of quick notes. Glassware, I know I don't have the correct one today, but in case you're wondering, a mug, a stein, tankard, or pint glass would be appropriate. And the serving temperature should be moderate at 9 to 11 degrees Celsius, which is 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit.
I'm going to say I've got the right glassware, even though I'm
you
not drinking.
do, yeah.
Lovely.
Yes. And
Yeah.
Thandi has the correct branded one too, so.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something we can dive into a little bit more too, is that bit around sort of trade, because there is a fun, specifically Irish anecdote around why Jonathan Swift said English porter was only fit for swine, because again, it's fascinating stuff. But I think I'll hold that one. We'll get back to that as we get into more stuff. I think there's many more things to discuss, but it is a good story. And I think for Irish listeners, you can be like, oh, I see what you did there.
So how do you make it, Thandi?
Oh my gosh. Well, okay. So if we're talking about the fact that stout and porter is a little bit much of a muchness at the moment, you know, they're not very different. So they'll be made quite a similar way. So we're talking about 70 to 80% is going to be your pale malt base. If you're going for an English porter, you want to use an English malt, so something like a Maris Otter. But then the other 20 to 30% of your grist is going to be made up on a number of different things depending on what you're going for. So if you're going to go for a bit more bready, biscuity, nutty flavors, you might have a lot more sort of crystal malts in your brewing mash schedule. If you're wanting a lot of chocolate, you might have brown malt or chocolate malt in there, or again a small amount of crystal. And if you are looking for more of a coffee flavor, which actually traditionally isn't really present in a porter, but it is present in a stout, you'd go for unmalted roasted grains. So how's that?
Yes.
So there is this weird difference when you're brewing that I don't know how true it is, to be honest. So I'll put it out to the crowds. But the one difference that I found within the BJCP anyway is that porters are said to be made from roasted malted grains, whereas stouts are unmalted roasted grains. So if you really wanted to be kind of true to style, you could stick with the malted roasted grains for a porter. But honestly,
And for the stupid people out there like me, what is the difference between, what was it, malted roasted grain and unmalted?
Good question.
Right.
So for those who haven't listened already, we did a great episode on Malt 101. That was now a little while back. So go back and listen to that. But for the shorthand, so when you're malting your grains, what you're doing is you're tricking it into thinking it's going to grow into a plant. But what we do is we soak it just enough so that it starts to sprout and cracks that husk open to reveal all of the starchy sugars inside that cereal grain. Now, what that does is it allows us to get to those starchy, sugary things in the middle, and that gives us the body and the sweetness that we'd get from brewing with it. Otherwise, without malting our grains, we are not going to get a whole lot of sweetness. We get a whole lot of husky bitterness. Now, it's kind of important because in stouts, you actually want that sort of toasty, roasty, almost slightly too bitter taste from your malt. But in porter, it's not as important. It's not as characteristic. You're wanting it to be a little bit more smooth. So therefore, you don't really go for the unmalted grains in this case. And one of the really big downfalls of people who enter into homebrew competitions with porters and with stouts sometimes is using too much. Too much unmalted grain gives you an extremely bitter, acrid beer. So you've got to be quite careful with those ones. Which is why I think a lot of people actually steer clear of it. But if you are going to use it, just be careful. You don't want to do too much of it. You can get your flavors, depending on what you're going for. You can get your flavors by using brown malts, chocolate malts, and then your variety of crystals. So whether they're lightly crystallized or quite heavily crystallized, you can get your different flavors from there. But it might be worthwhile to say that there are differences between the different kinds of porters, which I'm sure, Katie, you want to maybe take us through the different kinds of porters that we get.
Yeah, and you can hop in here and help me with like brewing stuff. So I'm going to start with like brown porter, which seems to be the quite traditional English style porter, quite low ABV, very malty. So picking up there on what Thandi was saying, it's like it's kind of sweet. It's a sweetish kind of flavor, and that would have been apparently the traditional one. And then what did they, maybe, we don't know, they exported this, right, to the Baltic region. And what they did is they slightly adapted it by, I believe, using a different yeast strain. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right.
And they came up with their Baltic Porter, which is made with a lager yeast.
Exactly. So if you're brewing the two, so a Baltic Porter has effectively the same grain bill and even the same hops as an English porter, but instead of using an English ale yeast strain, it's going to use a lager strain, and therefore your temperature control is going to be a bit different on it. It's going to ferment at a lower temperature, and you're going to age it and lager it. And what it does to it is it gives it a much cleaner finish. So instead of it being a little bit fruity, a little bit caramelly, all of the sort of residual flavors that you get from English style yeast or ale yeasts in general, lager yeast will give you a much cleaner, sort of breadier finish. So that's the really big difference between those two.
Yeah, and I like that they like adapted it for they were like, oh, we like this, let's make it ourselves, but make it better,
Yeah.
If you think it's better. I think it is. And if you ever want to find Baltic porters in Ireland, your Polski Sklep.
Yeah.
Okay. Your Polish shop, they have a great selection of them. Then when so I suppose Americans kind of decided that they would do the same thing, and that's where you get your robust porter, is more of an American type porter. And it's not as dark, apparently. It's you can kind of see the light through it a little bit. If we hold up what are they looking like? They're all very dark, right? They're very
I feel
dark.
like you can definitely get some robust porters that have a kind of almost ruby, kind of a characteristic. Yeah. And
they've more of a head than I suppose an English porter would have, or a brown porter. So
and then the main characteristic is obviously more hops. So I mean, the style, if we're talking about the balance of flavor within the style itself, It does have some bitterness. It's not going to be one of these styles that is so malt forward that you don't taste the bitterness. The bitterness should always be there in a porter. It's just that the hoppiness is really dialed up in American porters. So you might get a lot of the hoppy flavors. And because they'd be using American type hops, so cascades and citrus and all of the really citrusy, grapefruity, tropical, floral, or not floral, those ones. The flavor profile is a little different, even though the bitterness is fairly low between all of them. We're talking IBUs of an English porter is like 18 to 35 out of 100. This is basically out of 100. American porters are 25 to 50. So it can be dialed up quite a lot, but even the English porter can be pretty bitter. And also don't forget, because when you use roasted malts in a beer, it adds to the perception of bitterness. Even if it's not actual hop bitterness, it does add to that sense of bitterness, which is why you can use a balance between sort of roasted malts and hops to get you the right balance of perceived bitterness, even though your hops only add 70% of that or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah. And then also you have, like Lisa is drinking a vanilla porter, but you get oatmeal porters, you can get smoked porters,
Yeah,
you can get plum porter, you can, add lots of things to your porter, right?
Or you could barrel age them. I mean, I think there's been a lot of innovation recently with all the styles, but in my head, traditionally, I would have thought of, top fermenting yeast and focus on dark malts and not so much a focus on hops. But as we've just discovered in the last few minutes, like that's not necessarily always true. But I think, would it be fair to say for ABV, we're looking at like 4 to 5.5%? Is that what yours are?
Yeah, they're lower.
Or...
These aren't going to, well, traditionally they shouldn't be blowing your mind with their ABV,
Yeah.
Except for the Baltic Porter.
Yeah,
Exactly.
your Baltic ones are going to be up there. Yeah.
Baltic Porters are quite high. So they're anything from 6.5 up to like 9.5%. So those are quite a bit stronger than your regular porters.
Yeah, and here's something I've often wondered about, or I would say maybe wondered about over more the last 5 or 6 years, where we've seen a lot more sort of people trying to make really strong beers for one reason or another, is that you'll see things that are imperial porters and you're like, well, so it's a stout, like what is it? But okay, but equally, like, or is it a Baltic porter, but they didn't want to have to explain to people what it was, which is fair enough if you've got sort of if you're trying to get it out there alongside something very kind of easy drinking. It's not going to be that, but I wonder, is that why it's positioned that way? And I think to go back to the point around robust porter, like you say, a lot of those in America will be a little bit stronger. I know Martin Cornell will say, historically robust porter doesn't exist, which is true. It doesn't exist historically, but it clearly exists now. So it's sort of, how do we think about these different things that kind of overlap? And I think there's still a sort of broad perception amongst people who are a little bit less beer nerdy that, your porter is just less strong than your stout, which again, broadly true, but then you throw in a Baltic porter, you're not expecting that. What does it do to your head? So I just wonder what that journey is like for people who are maybe less familiar with the style. Like, is it getting confusing, all these different labels? And like you say, then you can put a lot of different things in it. It's such a good base to experiment with. So
yeah, I mean, we've mentioned a lot of different descriptors here, light to dark brown, caramel, creamy, smoke, coffee, chocolate. I mean, who wouldn't love it? Like, it's such a lovely style. And I think it was the first mass-produced beer, but then the London Porter anyway kind of fell out of favor because of the heavy taxation on the grains and the hops. But I mean, it's obviously made quite a comeback. So do you guys have any favorite porters that we haven't mentioned, or any breweries that you'd like to see make one? Or
I do have a favorite one that's now no longer made very often, but Trogs in Pennsylvania in America used to bring out every year for Halloween their Dead Reckoning Porter, which is a very hoppy porter, and it is glorious. Such a wonderful beer, and amazing on cask too, but I think they've stopped doing it or are not doing it as often, and I would just put that out there in the world. Please do it more often and send some to Ireland, maybe. Or, you know, someone here can also just make a very hoppy porter. Go for it, guys. It's really lovely. So
Yeah.
Trogue's Dead Reckoning, a favorite.
Yeah, there's an Irish one that's really nice. They do an oatmeal porter.
12 acres.
I can't remember the name of the brewery. They're in
12
Laois,
acres.
and they grow their own grain. What are they?
12 acres.
I think
12 acres. Yes.
Is it
there we
called
go.
Winter is Coming?
Yes,
Or,
it's a fabulous porter.
yeah.
It's a lovely porter.
Really, it's such a good one. Oh, that's exactly what I was thinking. At least of the ones that I've tasted recently, that one's stood out to me as being a really, really good porter. I love it. Absolutely love it. But yeah, I'd be keen. Lisa, come, let's circle back to your stories about porters for English, not for English swine. Tell me the rest of that one.
So it's a funny one. Again, all credit to Martin Cornell for digging up this wonderful little anecdote. But in October of 1736, Jonathan Swift, so everyone in Ireland, Dean Swift, so Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral here in Dublin, published this real sort of vitriolic attack on English porter. And give a little more background too. One of the recent episodes of Three Castles Burning did a whole interesting thing on Jonathan Swift, his relationship with the poor and working classes in Dublin, and you know, the complexities. They are really, really interesting. But I think it's important to know for background here that he was really, really trying to kind of raise up the local trade, really get people to basically buy local, shop local, instead of relying on English imports. Even though, again, he was also sort of a weird snob in certain ways and wanted to be living in London, and there's all kinds of really interesting stuff here. But, you know, Jonathan Swift, much more than writing Gulliver's Travels, he did all kinds of interesting stuff. And I think especially here in Dublin, we know him for a bit more as well. But he wrote essentially this attack on English porter, which was being imported. And he says, English porter was made of the worst malt which is sent from all parts of the country for that use, and consequently nothing but gin exceeds it for badness, and that the smell of London porter was sufficient for any creature above a swine. And he said Irish publicans selling English beers, and I think this is something we still see in some places, liquors inferior to those manufactured in Ireland, but esteemed because they are foreign. So it's fancy because it's from somewhere else. But the reason this has only sort of more recently been discovered is he wrote it under a pseudonym, and it's a wonderful pseudonym, Geoffrey Jinglestaff. So he wrote a lot of things under pseudonyms. This was a very common thing amongst sort of learned men of the 18th century. This is just, you know, what we did. But again, really good. You know, we'll put a link to it in the show notes on how we're pretty sure that this is in fact Jonathan Swift. But it's really fascinating because, you know, we're looking, you know, 1736, you know, we're not making a ton of London porter here in Dublin yet, but of course it's all about to kick off. You know, Arthur Guinness is going to be like, oh, people like that, and you know, the world will change. But it hasn't quite happened yet. So it's really, really interesting though that he's saying, you know, why are you guys buying all this foreign crap? You know, there's other stuff that's, you know, just as good. And they even list specific, specific pubs that are selling the English porter. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them are still around, but, you know, that would be an interesting tour if we could kind of go and figure out where they all were. So fascinating stuff.
That would be fabulous, wouldn't it?
I think so. Yeah, because we do have, and I don't think this was him, but someone else in the same in the same paper some years later says it is hoped the importation of this liquor will be stopped, and that several of our brewers have at this time a liquor equal in taste and goodness to the best London porter. But you know, that's about 25-30 years off still before Guinness is really gonna happen. But isn't that interesting that, you know, he's sort of foreshadowing kind of this, you know, huge giant. It hasn't happened yet, but he's saying, guys, shop local. And, you know, eventually, you know, the tide turns. So fascinating stuff.
There was that myth about Guinness using unmalted roasted grains to avoid tax on grains because they were imported from the UK and otherwise. But that apparently is a myth, so I don't want to spread it. But it was kind of funny, only in the sense that, you know, sometimes stories they're appealing because they sound nice, not just because they're true.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things that, you know, the reason that Guinness is, you know, so popular was because it was able to brew, you you know, these stouts, these lovely stouts with a different thing, and get away with a bit of a sneaky tax thing. But pity it's not true, because the story's great.
Now I have a question. Like stouts, would you find nitrogenated porters?
Oh, that's a good question. I've definitely seen one or two, but I wonder, in fact, I remember thinking at the time, I wonder if it's because they had run out of whatever stout they had and we're like, well, we've got a porter, we'll stick some nitro in and see what happens. But
yeah, I can't remember if I've ever seen one, but I can't see why you wouldn't put a porter
I mean,
on
because
nitro.
I've seen red ales and IPAs on nitro, so I mean,
yeah,
I couldn't see why not. Yeah.
Well, listen, the more we talk about beer styles, the more you realize like how many things are just so similar to each other. And you know the differences between a stout and a porter are so close. And then if you think of, you know, a porter, a London porter and an American porter and a Baltic porter, you know, besides things like ABV or yeasts, which are kind of fundamental, but they're actually very close. You know, they're darker malty beers with some hoppiness or some bitterness.
And is a red ale a brown ale, and is a brown ale then a porter, and do they all, you know, is it a spectrum that just,
Now, is a porter something you would drink in the summer?
I would.
I know it's maybe cooler than the 9 degrees, maybe a little bit cooler than probably as advertised, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I feel like I drink fewer Baltic porters in the summer, which is kind of odd because they do have that, like you're saying, that clean taste, but there's something about it, I guess it's just because it's stronger. I tend to shy away from them in the summer, but again, they have that different, you know, kind of flavor profile. So it's a good question.
Yeah. But, you know, even Baltic Porter, like what really is the difference between a Baltic Porter and a dark lager or a Schwarzbier?
Yeah, like a strong Schwarzbier, yeah.
Yeah. Damn it, guys. we're just revealing that all beer is actually the same. Like, come on.
Yeah, all those people are like, I don't like beer, it's all the same. We're like,
yeah.
That's like when people say, I don't like fish. And it's like, oh my God, there are so many different types of fish out there. How can you hate them all?
That's true.
Know?
That's true.
Same with beer. There's one out there for everyone.
Oh, I fully believe that. But it's funny because people will say, oh, I don't like stout. You know, it's so heavy and it's so, you know, alcoholic or whatever the case is. But you know, often a stout or a porter is less ABV and less body and less heavy than a pale ale or a lager or something else. So I never understand that connotation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a perception of it being like a meal or being like very calorific, and it must have started somewhere somehow, but it's definitely not true for me anyway. But I would like to see more low or non-alcoholic stouts and porters myself. Like I feel like that there aren't maybe as many as I'd like to see, but
yeah, I was excited to see that in the States, Deschutes is bringing out a non-alcoholic version of their Black Butte Porter, which is a wonderful beer, fantastic one. And it's one of those that I think in some cases, because it's sort of easy to get, people forget that it's there and kind of overlook it for things that are harder to get. Or, you know, but it's a wonderful beer, absolutely recommend it. I'm really curious to try the non-alcoholic version. And because I think, you know, the Guinness one being so well done, I think there's a lot of scope with stouts and, you know, other stouts and porters to do something really interesting, because at least you've got a little more to play with, you know, if you like flavor wise than you might with a pale ale or something. It's although again, it's, you know, they're hard to do well. So it's, you got to crack that nut, but I would love to see it.
And can you think of any other flavors such as your vanilla one that you've seen in a porter, like maybe a cherry or?
I've had a black cherry stout and porter actually, and sometimes that can be a little much. It can almost get into a kind of cough medicine kind of flavor, but I think if it's done well, it can be really nicely balanced. And I think there are a lot of kind of you know, sort of breakfast stouts and porters where they can throw almost anything in, whether that's sort of a maple syrup or you know, that kind of thing, which again sometimes can be a little much for me anyway. Other people probably love it. Coffee, certainly. I don't like coffee, so I don't like a coffee porter, but there are so many out there now. I think that's an interesting one.
But see, I think a coffee porter is just a stout. Like,
I wonder.
You know, because honestly, the difference that I always had in my head, now whether it was real or not, but the difference I had in my head was that porters are chocolate and caramel, stouts are chocolate and coffee.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
I know that that's a weird way to distinguish between them, but because stouts can be a little bit more toasted and a little bit more almost bitter, like bitter coffee. Like I always think coffee flavors are for stout and the rest is for everything else. But so if you put coffee into a porter, I'm going to call it a stout probably.
And again, perception is reality.
Yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting blind taste test, you know, to compare the smells and the flavors and then reveal what the labels were. Because they do look a lot alike on the surface. So yeah.
But you see, it's one of those things, and I know I'm probably a stuck record at this point with this sentiment, but my feeling is that brewers, because brewing or selling beer is effectively a marketing practice, it's not a brewing practice, you know, people can kind of say what they want. So whether you're talking about double dry hopped as a marketing term, or whether you're talking about coffee porters, like for me, it's just marketing. It's got nothing to do with the beer.
And I think you and I have talked about session ales versus pale ales and some of the other very similar styles as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's just thinking about that those sort of sub distinctions to go back to the idea of you know, a pint of plain is your only man. So you know, that would be talking about a plain porter as opposed to an extra stout or you know, all of those things. And you know, no one understands those gradations anymore. Okay, I'm not going to say no one because there's a lot of nerds like us on beer Twitter who are going to be very, you know, very saying no, which is good. We love you guys, so bring it. We love it, but. I think it's, you know, it's kind of a lost distinction, if you like, because I think certainly here, if someone orders a pint of plain, they're probably getting a Guinness, but it really should be for a porter. And I love like the porterhouse plain, wonderful porter. So it's, but I think that's kind of been lost probably over the last like maybe 15 to 20 years, that kind of, you know, almost folk memory of it, if you like.
Is that a distinctly Irish thing, Lisa?
I feel like the poem is certainly Irish, and so that's, I think, probably where it goes. But I do wonder, there's probably some work to be done there. Is, you know, did people have that distinction originally, like when it was kind of, you know, a London-based thing, or did that kind of arise once it started really being made here? Because I think, you know, to your point around marketing, you know, was that all sort of in Arthur Guinness's head and you know, the people working for him, and did they start to, you know, sort of get these different labels on things? Because yes, there are differences between certainly like you know, your extra stout, your foreign extra stout, and you know, your plain, but they're all, I don't want to say meaningless now, but I think they've certainly lost, or at least the meaning has changed, and that's okay. Things can evolve and change, but I do wonder how much, you know, again, to get to the idea of like a blind taste test, what would that look like if you're like, no, plain versus extra versus, you know, and I like to think Guinness has a Dublin porter that I've only seen like there at, you know, like I've seen like at the Open Gate and in the storehouse. It's like 2 or 3%, lovely beer, and would love to have it more available, but doesn't seem to make the rounds very often.
Yeah, I think the West Indies porter is the one that I've seen more in a lot of the shops that's readily available from them.
Yeah.
So does anyone have any final questions, concerns, comments?
sounds like a bad meeting.
Any complaints? Yeah. Well, I suppose then we can wrap things up. I would like to say thank you to my co-hosts, Thandi, Katie, and Lisa, and remind our listeners to like, rate, share, subscribe, review, and tell a friend. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as Buy Me a Coffee, and you can find us on wherever you listen to your podcasts, as well as YouTube. And with that, we will say cheers and have a good week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
And I'm sorry I'm so hungover.